As a foreigner who moved to the US on a fiancé visa, I'm losing my mind after 2.5 years. I came to the United States full of hope, believing I was stepping into a better life in what was supposedly the greatest country in the world. But I watched an SUV nearly crush my baby's stroller in broad daylight. The driver didn't even stop. My name is Zachary. I'm 31 years old, and this is the story of how the American dream almost destroyed everything I hold dear. I never thought I'd be the type of person to write one of these posts. You know, the ones where someone pours their heart out to strangers on the internet because they have nowhere else to turn. But here I am, typing this at 2 in the morning while my wife Bianca sleeps next to me and our son Hendrix breathes softly in his crib across the hall. I can't sleep anymore, not after what happened yesterday, not after what's been building up inside me for the past 2.5 years. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a time when America represented hope instead of fear. I met Bianca during her semester abroad in my home country. She was this bright-eyed education major from Ohio, full of passion for teaching and making a difference in children's lives. I was working at an international consulting firm, having spent 3 years in Germany and traveling extensively through Norway, Sweden, and Denmark for work. Those European experiences had shown me what a developed country could really offer: efficient public transportation, walkable cities, comprehensive healthcare, and a sense of safety that permeated daily life. When Bianca talked about America, her eyes would light up with this infectious enthusiasm. She painted pictures of endless opportunities, excellent schools, and a society where hard work was rewarded. Coming from a developing nation, I'll admit I was intrigued. Sure, I had a good life back home, but the promise of stability, of giving our future children the best possible start in life, was incredibly appealing. "You'll love it there, Zachary," she would say, holding my hands across candlelit dinners in small cafes near her university. "It's different from Europe, but in the best way. There's this energy, this optimism. People believe they can achieve anything." I believed her, more importantly, I believed in us. Our courtship was like something out of a romantic movie. Late-night video calls when she returned to Ohio, care packages sent across continents, and plans sketched out on napkins during my visits to see her. We talked about the house we'd buy, the schools our children would attend, the trips we'd take to show them the world. America wasn't just going to be my new home. It was going to be our launching pad for an incredible life together. The visa process was lengthy but exciting. Each form filled out, each interview completed, brought me one step closer to what I genuinely believed would be a better life. Bianca was patient through all the bureaucratic hurdles, and her family welcomed me with open arms during my visits. Her parents, Janet and Robert, seemed like the embodiment of the American middle class. Hardworking, optimistic, and generous with their time and affection. "We're so happy Bianca found someone like you," Janet told me during my first Thanksgiving with them. "Someone who appreciates what this country can offer, but also brings his own perspective. You're going to love living here, Zachary. There's so much opportunity, so much possibility." Those words meant everything to me then. I felt like I was joining not just a family, but a grand American story. The wedding was perfect. Small but elegant, held in Bianca's hometown church, with reception at the local country club. I wore my father's cufflinks, and Bianca wore her grandmother's pearl necklace. During our first dance, she whispered in my ear, "Welcome home, husband." For that moment, surrounded by twinkling lights and the warmth of family and friends, America felt exactly like what it was supposed to be. Our honeymoon in California reinforced all my positive expectations. We drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, stayed in charming bed and breakfasts, and visited national parks that took my breath away. The diversity of landscapes, the friendliness of strangers, the sense of boundless possibility, it all felt magical. "This is just the beginning," Bianca said as we watched the sunset from Big Sur. "Wait until you see what we can build together here." But honeymoons end, and reality has a way of creeping in slowly, then all at once. The first signs weren't dramatic. They were small disappointments that I told myself were just adjustment issues. The healthcare system was the initial shock. Back home, despite being a developing country, I had comprehensive coverage. Here, even with Bianca's teacher insurance, a simple doctor's visit required careful budgeting. When I got food poisoning 3 months after moving here, the emergency room bill was more than I used to make in 2 months back home. "It's just how it works here," Bianca explained, though I could see the stress in her eyes, as we figured out payment plans. "Once you get a good job with benefits, it'll be better. Everyone deals with this." But finding that good job proved more challenging than expected. My international experience, which had been an asset in Europe, seemed to count for little here. Employers wanted American experience, whatever that meant. I found myself taking contract work, bouncing between projects, never quite establishing the career stability I'd had before. The interviews were particularly frustrating. I'd sit across from hiring managers who seemed impressed by my qualifications until they learned about my background. "So, you've never worked in the American market?" they'd ask, as if my 3 years managing projects across 5 European countries somehow didn't translate to competence in Ohio. Well, no, but I've worked extensively with American companies in international contexts. I'd explain the principles of project management and client relations are universal, right? But this is different. American clients have different expectations. American business culture is unique. I wanted to ask how unique it could be when I'd successfully managed American clients from Berlin and Copenhagen, but I learned to keep those thoughts to himself. The transportation situation was another wake-up call. In Germany, I'd lived car-free for 3 years, relying on trains and buses that arrived precisely on schedule. Here, in Bianca's medium-sized Ohio City, a car wasn't just convenient, it was absolutely essential. The public transportation consisted of a few bus routes that ran infrequently and didn't connect the places I needed to go. "You'll get used to driving here," Bianca assured me. "Americans love their cars. It's freedom." But getting a license was surreal. The driving test was laughably easy compared to the rigorous examination I'd undergone in Europe. 15 minutes on quiet suburban streets, parallel parking between cones in an empty lot, and suddenly I was licensed to operate a 2-ton death machine on highways filled with distracted drivers. The casual attitude toward driving safety bothered me from day one, but I pushed the concern aside. This was just different, not necessarily wrong. Or, so I told myself. The car itself became another source of stress. We couldn't afford anything reliable. So, we bought a 10-year-old sedan with 150,000 miles that required constant repairs. Every month brought new mechanical problems, and the costs quickly added up. Between car payments, insurance, gas, maintenance, and parking fees, transportation was consuming nearly a quarter of our budget. "At least we have mobility," Bianca would say when I complained about the latest repair bill. Imagine trying to get around without a car. I didn't have to imagine. I'd lived it in multiple European cities where not owning a car was a lifestyle choice, not a poverty sentence. The neighborhood dynamics puzzled me too. Back home, despite economic challenges, there was a sense of community. Neighbors knew each other, children played together in the streets, and public spaces were truly public. Here, everyone retreated behind their perfectly manicured lawns and privacy fences. The American dream seemed to include dreaming alone. I tried to connect with our neighbors, but the responses were consistently polite, yet distant. "Good morning, Frank," I'd say to our next-door neighbor as we both retrieved our morning newspapers. "Morning," he'd grunt back, already heading toward his front door. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yep," door closes. After months of similar interactions, I asked Bianca if I was doing something wrong. "No, that's just how Frank is," she said. "Americans value their privacy, it's not personal." But it felt personal when you came from a culture where neighbors looked out for each other, where community was built through daily interactions, where isolation was seen as a problem to be solved rather than a preference to be respected. The social isolation became more pronounced when we started attending Bianca's church. The congregation was friendly enough during Sunday services, but invitations to social events were rare, and deeper friendships seemed to require years of careful cultivation. People were nice, but not necessarily open, welcoming but not necessarily inclusive. When Bianca got pregnant with Hendrix, I thought everything would click into place. Surely becoming a father in America would unlock all those opportunities and securities we'd talked about. The pregnancy went smoothly, and when our son arrived, healthy, beautiful, perfect, I felt that surge of paternal protectiveness that I'd heard other fathers describe. "He's going to have such incredible opportunities here," Bianca said. Cradling our newborn in the hospital room that cost us $4,000 despite having insurance. The best schools, the best chances to succeed. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the struggles and disappointments were just growing pains, the price of admission to a better life for our son, but the hospital experience itself was jarring. And the billing process was Byzantine in its complexity. We received separate bills from the hospital, the attending physician, the anesthesiologist, the pediatrician, and the laboratory. Each bill came with different payment terms, different insurance negotiations, and different levels of coverage. "This is normal," our nurse explained when I expressed confusion about the billing. "American healthcare is complicated, but you'll figure it out." The idea that healthcare should be complicated seemed fundamentally wrong to me. In every other developed country I'd experienced, medical care was straightforward. You got sick, you got treated, and the system handled the logistics. Here, patients were expected to be their own insurance advocates, medical billing experts, and healthcare system navigators, while simultaneously dealing with illness or injury. As Hendrix grew from infant to toddler, Bianca's stories from her elementary school started painting a different picture of American education. As a third-grade teacher, she saw the system from the inside, and what she described horrified me. Overcrowded classrooms, insufficient supplies, and a standardized testing regime that seemed designed to crush creativity rather than nurture it. Today, a 7-year-old asked me if the lockdown drill was because bad men were coming to hurt them. She told me one evening, exhaustion heavy in her voice, "How do I explain active shooter drills to a child who should be worried about spelling tests and playground games?" The school shooting statistics kept me awake at night. In the Nordic countries I'd visited, the idea of armed guards in elementary schools would be unthinkable. Here, it was just another Tuesday. If something happens, we need the kids to know what to do. But why is something happening a reasonable expectation? I asked. Why have we accepted that children need to prepare for violence as part of their normal education? Bianca didn't have a good answer for that, and I could see in her eyes that the question bothered her too. The drills weren't the only concerning aspect of Hendrix's future educational environment. Bianca regularly brought home stories of students who came to school hungry because their families couldn't afford adequate nutrition. She described classrooms where basic supplies like pencils and paper were rationed because the school budget couldn't cover necessities. She talked about gifted students who were bored and disruptive because there weren't resources for enrichment programs, and struggling students who fell further behind because there weren't resources for additional support. "I spend my own money on classroom supplies," she told me, showing me receipts for construction paper, markers, and books. "All the teachers do. If we don't, the kids just go without." The idea that teachers in the world's wealthiest nation should have to personally fund basic educational materials seemed insane to me. In Germany, I'd visited schools where technology, supplies, and enrichment programs were simply assumed to be available because education was properly funded. Still, I told myself we were building something. Every frustration was temporary, every disappointment a stepping stone to something better. Hendrix was thriving, Bianca loved teaching despite the system's flaws, and I was slowly building a professional network. We found a nice rental house in a decent neighborhood, started a small emergency fund, and began talking about buying our first home. The house hunting process revealed new layers of American complexity that I hadn't anticipated. Property taxes varied wildly between districts, often based on funding formulas that seemed designed to perpetuate inequality. The best schools were in the most expensive neighborhoods, creating a system where educational opportunity was directly tied to housing costs. "We can't afford the Westfield district," our real estate agent explained, showing us a beautiful house that was technically within our budget. "The property taxes there are $8,000 a year, and the mortgage company won't approve you with that much additional debt." "But the schools there are excellent," Bianca said wistfully, looking at the test scores and graduation rates. "Right, that's why the property taxes are so high. Good schools drive up property values, which drives up taxes, which funds the schools. It's a cycle that ensured children's educational opportunities were determined by their parents' income rather than their individual potential or needs." We settled on a house in a middle-tier district with middle-tier schools and middle-tier property taxes. It was fine, but fine felt like settling after the promises of excellence we'd been sold. The mortgage process itself was another education in American financial complexity. Despite having excellent credit and stable employment, we were required to provide documentation that seemed excessive even by German bureaucratic standards. Bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, employment verification letters, and explanations for every deposit or withdrawal over $500. Why do they need to know about the $600 I transferred from my savings account? I asked our loan officer. "Money laundering regulations," she explained. "We have to document the source of all funds to make sure you're not borrowing money for the down payment or getting cash from illegal sources." The assumption of guilt until proven innocent felt un-American in the most literal sense, contradicting everything I'd been told about American values of trust and opportunity. Then came the incident that shattered my remaining illusions about American safety and civility. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. The weather was perfect, that crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive. Bianca had gotten off work early, and we decided to take Hendrix for a walk around the neighborhood. He was 8 months old then, just starting to pull himself up in his crib, all chubby cheeks and infectious giggles. We had developed a routine on these walks. Hendrix loved looking at the trees, pointing at squirrels, and babbling at dogs behind fences. It was one of the few times I felt genuinely peaceful in America, just a family enjoying a beautiful day in a safe neighborhood. We were crossing at a marked intersection 3 blocks from our house, the same intersection we'd crossed dozens of times before. Bianca was pushing the stroller while I carried the diaper bag. The walk signal was clearly illuminated, and we were well within the crosswalk lines. Hendrix was babbling happily, pointing at leaves falling from the oak trees that lined the street. I was actually smiling, thinking about how much he'd grown since we'd started these walks. When I heard the engine, a black SUV came barreling through the intersection, completely ignoring the red light. It couldn't have been going less than 40 miles per hour in a residential zone with a 25 mile per hour speed limit. The vehicle missed the front of Hendrix's stroller by maybe 18 inches, close enough that I could feel the wind displacement as it roared past. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. I watched the SUV approach, calculated the trajectory, realized with crystal clarity that we were about to watch our son die. And then somehow, the vehicle passed by without contact. The whole sequence probably lasted 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The driver didn't slow down, didn't stop, didn't even tap the brakes, didn't show any awareness that they'd nearly committed vehicular manslaughter in broad daylight. "Oh my God," Bianca screamed, instinctively pulling the stroller backward. "Oh my God, Zachary, did you see that? Did you see how close I couldn't speak?" I was frozen, staring at the spot where my son had been seconds before, calculating angles and speeds and how close we'd come to losing everything. 18 inches between our family and devastation. Other pedestrians had witnessed the incident. A jogger stopped and asked if we were okay. An elderly woman walking her dog shook her head and muttered something about crazy drivers these days. But nobody seemed surprised. Nobody acted like what we'd just experienced was unusual or unacceptable. "We need to call the police," I managed to say, pulling out my phone with shaking hands. "What's the point?" the jogger asked. "Unless someone got the license plate, there's nothing they can do. Happens all the time around here." But I called anyway, because in a functioning society, nearly killing a baby should have consequences. The police officer who responded was polite but essentially useless. He took our statement, acknowledged that yes, running red lights was illegal, and suggested we be more careful when crossing streets. As if we had somehow contributed to nearly watching our infant son get crushed by a speeding vehicle while legally using a crosswalk. "Did you get a license plate number?" Officer Williams asked, pen poised over his notepad. "No, it happened too fast, and we were focused on getting out of the way." "Make or model of the vehicle?" "Black SUV, maybe a Suburban or Tahoe, tinted windows." He wrote that down, though we both knew it was useless information. Half the vehicles in our neighborhood were black SUVs with tinted windows. "Happens more than you'd think," Officer Williams said with a shrug. "That will haunt me forever. People don't pay attention anymore. Too many distractions. Cell phones, GPS, music. Everyone's in a hurry. We can increase patrols in the area, but we can't be everywhere at once." The casual acceptance was almost worse than the incident itself. This wasn't being treated as a near tragedy that demanded investigation and prevention. It was being treated as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of modern life. That night, after Hendrix was asleep and Bianca had finally stopped shaking, I sat in our living room and really looked at our life. I mean, really looked. With the scales fallen from my eyes, we lived in a country where obtaining a driver's license required less skill, demonstration than getting a library card in some European cities, where healthcare bankruptcy was a legitimate fear for middle-class families, where children practiced hiding from gunmen in their elementary schools, where public transportation was so inadequate that being unable to drive essentially meant being unable to participate in society. Most crushingly, we lived in a place where a stranger could nearly kill our baby and face absolutely no consequences because accidents happen and people don't pay attention anymore. The American dream I'd bought into was a lie. Not completely. There were opportunities here, freedoms and possibilities that didn't exist everywhere. But the cost was so much higher than anyone had told me. The cost was living in constant low-level fear for your family's safety. The cost was accepting that basic human needs like healthcare and education were luxury commodities. The cost was raising your children in a society that had normalized violence and recklessness to a degree that would be unthinkable in the developed nations I'd experienced. "Maybe we should move back," I suggested to Bianca that night. Not necessarily to my home country, but somewhere safer. Somewhere better for Hendrix. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. This is my home, Zachary. My family is here. My job is here. And despite everything, there are still opportunities here that don't exist elsewhere. But what if next time that SUV doesn't miss? I asked. What if next time we're not lucky? She didn't have an answer for that. The weeks following the near-miss incident brought a clarity I hadn't expected. I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked or rationalized away. The casual acceptance of danger became impossible to ignore. At Hendrix's pediatrician appointment, I mentioned our close call to Dr. Morrison, thinking she might offer some reassurance or perspective. Instead, she nodded knowingly and said, "Oh yes, I see parents all the time who've had similar experiences. It's just part of living in a car-centric society. You learn to be extra vigilant." Extra vigilant, as if the burden of safety should fall entirely on parents rather than on creating a society where children don't regularly face mortal danger from everyday activities like crossing the street. But shouldn't there be better enforcement? I asked. Better infrastructure design? Better driver education? Dr. Morrison shrugged. That's above my pay grade. I just treat the patients who don't get out of the way fast enough. The normalization was everywhere once I started looking. Bianca's teaching colleagues shared stories of lockdown drills and security concerns with the same casual tone they used to discuss lesson plans. Neighbors talked about break-ins and package theft, like weather reports. Unfortunate, but inevitable. You just have to be smart about it. Our neighbor Frank told me when I mentioned feeling unsafe. Good security system, motion lights, keep your car locked. Common sense stuff. But why should common sense include fortifying your home like a medieval castle? In the Norwegian cities I'd visited, people regularly left their bicycles unlocked. Children walked to school unaccompanied. The idea of requiring armed security in educational institutions would be viewed as a societal failure, not an acceptable precaution. I started researching crime statistics, traffic safety data, and international comparisons. The numbers were sobering. American pedestrian fatality rates were dramatically higher than comparable developed nations. American school shooting rates were incomparably higher than anywhere else on Earth. American healthcare costs were exponentially higher, with demonstrably worse outcomes than countries with universal systems. The contrast became more stark as I researched our options. Through my work connections, I learned about a position in Copenhagen that would utilize my international experience and pay comparably to what I could expect here. The Danish healthcare system, education quality, and infrastructure were demonstrably superior to what we had access to in Ohio. But Denmark is so expensive, Bianca argued, when I brought up the possibility, and the taxes are so high. The taxes are high because they actually fund public services, I replied. When you factor in what we pay for healthcare, childcare, and education here, plus the costs of car ownership and home security, the financial difference isn't as dramatic as it seems. I had done the math between health insurance premiums, copays, and deductibles. We were spending $12,000 annually on healthcare with significant gaps in coverage. Our car costs, payments, insurance, gas, maintenance, and parking totaled nearly $8,000 per year. Property taxes for decent schools added another $6,000. Home security system, higher insurance rates due to crime, and other safety measures cost another $2,000. That was $28,000. In expenses that would be largely unnecessary in a properly functioning social democracy, the Danish tax rate would need to be astronomical to exceed what we were already paying for inferior services. More importantly, the quality of life difference was substantial. Hendrix could grow up in a society where his biggest worry would be academic performance, not active shooters, where public transportation would give him independence and mobility, where healthcare would be a right, not a privilege requiring careful financial planning. The final straw came during what should have been a routine grocery shopping trip. Bianca was at work, so I had taken Hendrix to the supermarket in his stroller. While waiting in the checkout line, I heard raised voices from the customer service counter. A woman in her 40s was screaming at a teenage employee about a coupon dispute, using language that would make a sailor blush. The girl behind the counter couldn't have been older than 17, and she was visibly fighting back tears as the customer berated her over 50 cents. "You people are all incompetent," the woman shouted. "I've been shopping here for 15 years, and this is how you treat loyal customers? Over 50 cents. I want to speak to your manager right now." The teenager stammered an apology and called for her supervisor, but the woman continued her tirade. "This is exactly what's wrong with your generation. No work ethic, no customer service skills, no respect for paying customers. But what struck me wasn't the profanity or even the cruelty, it was the way everyone else in the store simply ignored it. Customers continued shopping, employees continued working, and a grown woman's public meltdown over 50 cents was treated as completely normal background noise. In that moment, pushing my son's stroller through a store where verbal abuse was so commonplace that it didn't even warrant attention, I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't raise Hendrix in a society where cruelty and selfishness were not just tolerated but expected. The manager eventually appeared and resolved the coupon issue in the customer's favor, apologizing profusely for the misunderstanding. The teenage employee wiped her eyes and returned to work. The abusive customer left with her 50-cent savings and no consequences for her behavior. That was horrible. I said to the cashier as she rang up my groceries. She glanced around nervously. Yeah, well, the customer is always right, you know? No, I wanted to say the customer is not always right. Sometimes the customer is wrong, and sometimes the customer is cruel, and sometimes society should prioritize protecting 17-year-old employees over enabling middle-aged bullies. But I could see in her eyes that she'd been trained to accept abuse as part of her job, just like I'd been trained to accept that nearly getting my son killed was part of living in America. That evening, I had the conversation I'd been dreading with Bianca. I need us to seriously consider leaving, I said after Hendrix was asleep. Not immediately, not impulsively, but as a real family decision. I can't keep pretending that this is the best we can do for our son. Bianca was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and tired. I know you're right about a lot of things, she said. The healthcare system is broken. The education system is struggling. There's too much violence, too much anger, too much selfishness. But, Zachary, this is still my home. My mom and dad are getting older, and I can't imagine not being close to them. My students need teachers who care about them. And, despite everything, there are good people here doing good work. I'm not saying there aren't good people, I replied. You're one of them. Your parents are wonderful. But good people shouldn't have to work 3 times as hard just to maintain basic safety and dignity. Good people shouldn't have to choose between medical care and financial stability. Good children shouldn't have to practice hiding from killers. We talked until nearly dawn, cycling through the same arguments and emotions. Love for each other, love for our son, love for the idea of America versus the reality of America, the weight of immigration, how leaving would mean starting over again, learning new systems, building new professional networks, the complexity of international moves with a young child. What if we're just running away from problems instead of trying to solve them? Bianca asked. What if we're taking responsibility for our family's well-being instead of sacrificing our son's future for abstract principles? I countered. By morning, we hadn't reached a resolution, but we had reached an understanding. This wasn't about loving or hating America. It was about making the best possible choices for our family's future, even if those choices were complicated and painful. The decision ultimately came down to a simple question. In 10 years, when Hendrix is old enough to understand the world around him, do we want him asking us why we stayed in a place where his safety and well-being were constantly at risk, or why we had the courage to seek something better? Over the following months, we began seriously researching our options. The Danish position remained available, and my former European colleagues provided encouraging feedback about family life in Scandinavia. Bianca started looking into international schools where her teaching experience would be valued. We began the complex process of understanding visa requirements, housing markets, and cultural integration challenges. The research phase was both exciting and terrifying. Every positive discovery about life in Denmark was accompanied by anxiety about leaving everything familiar behind. Every conversation with expat families revealed new challenges we hadn't considered: language barriers, cultural differences, professional networking from scratch. But the more we learned, the more convinced I became that we were making the right choice. Danish work-life balance allowed parents to actually be present for their children's development. The education system emphasized creativity and critical thinking over test preparation. Healthcare was comprehensive and accessible. Public transportation connected communities instead of isolating them. The hardest part was telling Bianca's parents. Janet cried when we explained our reasoning. Not because she disagreed with our assessment, but because she understood it too well. I hate that you're right, she said, holding Hendrix while we discussed our timeline. I hate that this country has become a place where young families feel unsafe. When Robert and I were raising Bianca, we worried about grades and friendships and normal parent things. You're worrying about whether your child will survive elementary school? Robert was characteristically practical. If I were your age with a young family, I might make the same choice, he admitted. The America we raised our daughter in doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe it never existed the way we thought it did. That conversation was both heartbreaking and liberating. Having Bianca's parents acknowledge the validity of our concerns removed the last barrier to moving forward with our plans. The logistics of international relocation with a toddler proved challenging but manageable. Hendrix was young enough that the transition wouldn't traumatize him, old enough that the move wouldn't disrupt crucial early development. My professional network helped navigate work visa requirements, while Bianca's education credentials translated well to international school positions. The paperwork was extensive but straightforward compared to American bureaucracy. Danish immigration authorities were efficient, transparent, and helpful. Questions were answered directly, timelines were realistic, and the process felt designed to welcome qualified immigrants rather than discourage them. 6 months later, we were boarding a flight to Copenhagen with one-way tickets and 2 years' worth of planning behind us. The first month was difficult: jet lag, paperwork, finding housing, adjusting to new systems and expectations. But by the second month, the differences became clear. Hendrix could play in public parks without Bianca constantly scanning for potential threats. Healthcare appointments were scheduled based on medical need, not insurance authorization. The infrastructure worked efficiently and safely. Most importantly, the social contract was different. Individual rights existed within a framework of collective responsibility. People weren't expected to fend for themselves against systemic failures because the systems actually functioned. A year later, I can honestly say we made the right choice. Hendrix is thriving in Danish daycare, already picking up his third language. Bianca loves teaching in an environment where education is properly funded and violence isn't a daily concern. My career has flourished in a culture that values international experience rather than viewing it with suspicion. Do I miss America? I miss the America I thought existed. I miss the generosity and optimism of individual Americans like Bianca's parents. I miss the diversity and energy of American cities. I miss the idea of America as a place where dreams come true through hard work and determination. But I don't miss the reality of America. I don't miss calculating whether we could afford medical care. I don't miss the constant low-level anxiety about Hendrix's safety. I don't miss living in a society where basic human decency is considered naive rather than normal. The American dream isn't a lie, exactly. It's more like a lottery ticket. Some people win, but the odds are worse than advertised, and the cost of playing is higher than anyone tells you up front. If you're reading this and considering similar choices, I won't tell you what to do. Every family's situation is unique, and there are trade-offs to any major life decision. But I will tell you this: don't let anyone convince you that wanting safety, healthcare, and dignity for your family makes you ungrateful or unpatriotic. Don't let anyone tell you that systematic failures are individual responsibilities. You deserve better. Your children deserve better. And sometimes, getting better means having the courage to admit that the dream you were sold isn't the reality you're living. To those of you still fighting to make America worthy of its promises, I admire your persistence and hope you succeed. The country needs people like you, people who refuse to accept that dysfunction is inevitable. To those of you considering your own escape routes, know that life exists beyond American borders. There are places where healthcare doesn't bankrupt families, where children can attend school without fear, where public transportation works and communities function. The world is bigger than one country's version of success. And to my fellow immigrants who feel trapped between the country you left and the one that doesn't quite welcome you, remember that citizenship is about more than paperwork. You have the right to seek safety, opportunity, and dignity for your families, wherever that might lead you. As I write this, Hendrix is napping in his bedroom in our Copenhagen apartment. When he wakes up, we'll walk to the neighborhood playground where children from dozen different countries play together while their parents chat in the autumn sunshine. Tonight, Bianca will come home from school with stories of engaged students and supportive colleagues rather than security concerns and resource shortages. This is what the American dream was supposed to feel like: safe, hopeful, and filled with genuine opportunity. I'm grateful we found it, even if we had to leave America to get it. The SUV that nearly killed my son will probably never face consequences for reckless driving. The systems that failed us will continue failing other families. The American dream will keep selling itself to people who deserve better than what it delivers, but my family is safe now. We're building the life we were promised in a place that actually provides it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that the dream you were chasing isn't worth the nightmare you're living. Sometimes coming to America means learning when it's time to leave. Thank you for reading this far. I hope you and your families stay safe, wherever home might be for you.